So what happened? 40 acres and a mule, the reparations deal with the American government was broken. What happened next? Well, we enter into a period called Reconstruction. We're going to talk about it. Come, let's do our homework. So we've been talking about 40 acres and a mule, the deal that the federal government had with newly freed Black people who had been enslaved during the Civil War and found themselves released into a whole new world. Now they were free in the United States, but with no infrastructure, no education, scattered to the winds. Their families had been sold off and lost. They needed some help getting their feet under them so that they could become thriving members of society. And for a moment, we were on the right track as a nation. Abraham Lincoln had a plan for Reconstruction for the South. He wanted to reincorporate the seceded states and offer citizenship to the newly freed Black people. However, things went off the rails when Lincoln was assassinated and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, took over. And yes, it's Andrew Johnson. Some of you thought you were going to correct me and tell me that it was Andrew Jackson. It's a different asshole, different old white dude, same asshole tendencies. Andrew Jackson is the guy that's on the $20 bill. He is also a piece of shit, but he was long dead before Andrew Johnson took over and ran our country into a ditch right after the Civil War. So how did things go so horribly wrong? Well, the most important thing to remember is how quickly this all went down, right? So last time we talked about William Sherman writing his field order number 15. And that was where we get this phrase, 40 acres and a mule. So he writes this order in January of 1865, and it is quickly adopted by President Lincoln. And almost immediately, Congress establishes the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, this is a governmental agency at the federal level that was designed to help the newly freed Black people establish their new lives, right? Become citizens, find their families, get married, all that stuff. Then a month later, the Civil War officially ends. Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. That's the part of history that everybody, white people, are taught, right? The end of the Civil War here. And then we're just supposed to think everything went back to normal and got hunky-dory. But that's not the experience of the newly freed Black people, especially in the South. Because just 5 days after the Civil War officially ends, Lincoln is assassinated by a Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth. But that's not all that went down on April 14th, 1865. The plan was much bigger. Yeah, John Wilkes Booth was on the side of the South. He was pissed about Lincoln's plans to reincorporate Black people into society. There was major systemic racism behind most of the stuff that went down subsequently. Was Lincoln assassinated successfully? Yes. But what we aren't often reminded of is that there was also a plot to assassinate Andrew Johnson, except his would-be assassin decided not to go through with it. Is that because Johnson was a Confederate sympathizer? Probably. And the third part of the plan was to assassinate William Seward, who was Lincoln's Secretary of State. Now, Seward was also much along the Lincoln plan of Reconstruction, getting the South back together to rejoin the Union, but also bring along racial equality to the new United States of America. And this was a seriously dirty deed. The guy that was supposed to assassinate William Seward, it all happened on the same night. And Seward is attacked in his home. The guy bum rushes his house, jumps into his bed, stabs him in the face and the neck. Then, of course, there's a nationwide hunt for the bad guys. So you can just imagine the chaos that's happening in the country right now. A couple of weeks later, General Oliver Howard becomes the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. Howard, that name familiar? Yeah, he's the guy that helped found Howard University. I mean, and this has all happened in only a few months, right? Sherman wrote his articles in January of 1865. It's now May of 1865. The war has ended. The president's been assassinated and chaos reigns. This is all happening very, very quickly. Now, in May of 1865, our new president, Andrew Johnson, decides to totally scrap Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. And talk about a little bitch. He is a little bitch about it because he's butthurt that the South was going to suffer so much. He was from Tennessee. He was a Confederate sympathizer too, and he didn't think that the South should have to suffer for their crimes. So the first thing he does is revokes Sherman's order. So guess what? No 40 acres and a mule for any of the freed black people. Absolutely not. He says, okay, yeah, fine. We'll stick with the 13th Amendment. We'll abolish slavery, but let them figure it out for themselves. Let the states figure it out for themselves. That's his whole mantra, that the federal government is not going to help anybody. Fuck them. His other thing that he does is he pardons all the Confederate criminals from the war. Sound familiar yet? The other thing he does here is he returns all the seized land back to the white people who had been operating it before the war. So if you were a plantation owner in the South and you seceded from the Union, instead of being charged with treason and sent to prison, and that land is now unoccupied, and so he was going to give it to the freed slaves and they were going to farm it, he pardons everybody. Nobody's going to jail. In fact, here's your land back, guys. Here you go. I know you had a plantation here before. Now you can just take over, carry on as you were. No worries. Everybody's pardoned. Nobody's in trouble. And he decides he does not think that blacks should be granted citizenship. So they're in this weird limbo area of not being slaves anymore, but they're not full citizens. So they have no judicial rights. They can't own land or property. They're like stuck in this weird place. So what happens? You become a sharecropper, an indentured servant. People were desperate to make a living, and without land ownership or actual citizenship rights, they just became one step beyond where they had been before.